The title of our next discussion is Big Tech and the well-being of consumers, businesses, and society. Now, if you had posed that as the title of a discussion a couple of years ago, it might have seemed, 2 or 3 years ago, it might have seemed to most people a little curious. Back in those halcyon days, big tech companies were almost universally admired as having revolutionized the public's access to information, entertainment, purchasing, social networks, each other, just about everything in life. It would be like having a panel discussion about whether or not motherhood and apple pie was beneficial to the well-being of society. But of course, in the last few years, particularly in the United States and in Europe, although many of these issues have also been of concern in Asia, but issues related to privacy and the use of data, political and social concerns around elections in the United States, fake news, issues about question marks about pricing, the possible abuse of what seem to be monopolies in areas of advertising and search, and the sheer scale of many of these companies, and even issues of mental health and subjects like internet and phone addiction. There's been a pretty significant sea change in public attitudes towards big tech, and certainly in political attitudes towards big tech, again in the United States and Europe. Europe has been aggressively pursuing some of the big tech companies, the European Commission, Google in particular, but also increasingly some of the social network companies. And in the United States, the big tech companies have become flashpoints for considerable political controversy. Now, the response that they've had is to address some of these concerns, some of the issues over privacy, some of the issues over some of the political concerns that they've had, but the debate goes on. And again, so many of these issues, as I say, while they're of particular interest to people in the United States and Europe, the issues raised by the scale of big tech, the ability of big tech companies to access, organize, manipulate, and use data is a universal concern. In terms of their ability over issues, again, of privacy, of monopoly pricing power, and issues like that. So the question is very much a live one. What should we do about these now enormously dominant companies? 8 of the 10 largest companies in the world are technology companies. They have enormous influence over so many aspects of our lives, and the concern about them is growing. So what's the right political, regulatory, and indeed for businesses, business response to these issues? So to start off with, I should say, by the way, we are going to, I know you all, I'm sure, have downloaded the Summit app. I know you were voting earlier. We will have a poll question for you in a minute. But before we do that, I want to just get an introductory round of observations from our panel on some of these issues. And if I could start with you, Tyler. As I say, there's been a pretty big change in the way in which the public views many of the big tech companies. While they still like their products, there is growing concern about their power and growing question marks among politicians in the US and around the world about whether that power needs to be restrained by regulation. Give us your sense, if you would, of the landscape right now and what is happening and what kind of challenges are posed from a regulatory perspective by the big tech companies.
I'm a fan of big tech, but I think right now big tech has been hit by the perfect storm. So you have a lot of Democrats who are very unhappy that Trump was elected. They don't want to admit he actually won the election. Sometimes they blame the tech companies, especially Facebook. With Republicans and conservatives, there's the fear that these are California companies peopled by left-wingers who discriminate against conservative outputs in terms of the media. So they're upset. The media itself, Facebook and Google are the biggest competitors to a big slice of American and also global media. And Facebook and Google have been beating them rather soundly. So I find more and more newspapers are anti-tech because they see big tech as, in essence, eating their lunch. Businesses in general, if you look at, say, booksellers, they have lost ground to Amazon. There are so many businesses that will tell you one way or another, oh, big tech, it is competing unfairly. But most of what big tech is doing, for all of the problems, it's selling products at a lower price or a zero price, increasing product variety, boosting the tech ecosystem by having innovations that spill over into areas as diverse as cloud computing or driverless cars. And finally, if you look at the people who actually use this stuff, they are in essence voting with their feet. Not only do they use Google and Facebook to an extraordinary degree, but if you poll them, are you happy with the big tech experience? Do you mostly like these companies? Those companies will do better than just about any other, say, American big business or global big business when you ask people or look at what they do.
Oliver, if I may come to you, I suspect you may disagree with some of that.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit. But as a financial services firm, we were not being really loved by consumers the last 10 years. So I feel a little bit sympathy with Andrew and others around what's happening.
You must be pleased the spotlight has moved from financial services.
It has moved. It has moved quite a bit, but has not moved enough. The point is not what consumers say, because they may not understand what's going behind it. At the end of the day, the question is, do you have something that Samuelson calls a market failure, right? We have market failures everywhere with externalities. We can still price CO2, so we know that. The issue is, do we have monopolies, and are monopolies abusing their monopoly position, yes or no? And do we have fair competition? The complication is that we do not have an established framework on how to assess the benefits on the one hand of these developments, innovation on the one hand, and on the downside. So to echo something that was said on the panel before, we need to have regulators that actually understand what's going on. That's the first issue, and politicians that understand. And here's the fear of those that have to be regulated, is that we may not have regulators and politicians that actually understand what's happening in the tech world and the economics behind that. Looking at, as we are seeing, we see a lot of behavior that is not consistent. So there are platforms that basically say you can offer your products on our platform, but only if you offer demonstrably the lowest price. And by the way, you cannot sell this product on any other platform. If we did that in our distribution channels, I personally would go immediately to jail. So just to put it right, so we have to think about whatever is called a level playing field very quickly. Now, again, I'm not in favor of nationalization. I just think we need to think about competition rules that reflect reality, and they have to be adapted, as we heard earlier, very quickly. But we cannot have it run as it is at the moment, which is nobody checks.
Tom, if I may turn to you, you've been a regulator, so I'm confident that you've been in the industry too, confident you understand the issues, as Oliver says is necessary to. But let me put it to you, despite what Oliver says, that these companies clearly have monopolies in terms of their dominance of by any normal measure of monopoly. And by the way, this applies too to the big Asian companies, the big Chinese companies in their fields. They clearly have monopoly positions. But to raise Tyler's question, they are not. There's certainly no evidence, as far as we can tell, that they are indulging in monopolistic practices. Prices that the monopolistic prices. They're not extracting economic rent. They are providing services, products, and goods to people at very, very low cost, more or less, cost and prices that are almost consistent with perfect competition. Very high levels of customer satisfaction. They're improving people's lives in all kinds of ways. What's the problem?
Well, I think, Jerry, the issue here is that at the core of these businesses is siphoning off as much personal information about you and your friends as possible, and then locking it away so that it is available only to this information gatekeeper, and then using the leverage of that monopoly of information to deny access to competitors because they don't have the core asset, to go after traditional providers of services such as the print media, and to expand into markets that are adjacent but different markets, and to exploit the information they have. And so the challenge becomes that when you have these kinds of so-called network effects, where the more users you have, the more information you have, which means the more users you have, which means the more information you have, which means the more untouchable you are. How do you deal with that reality, which is an information age reality, but as one of the folks in the previous panel talked about, we are trapped in an environment where we try and deal with new information age realities using industrial age tools. And as a guy who used to have to regulate these networks based upon regulations that were, or legislation that was developed at a time when the internet wasn't even thought of, this is a challenge, and we need a new set of rules to protect internet capitalism, like we developed rules at the beginning of the 20th century to protect industrial capitalism.
Thank you. Andy, if I may turn to you as the representative here of, I mean, many things, Andy. You've a very long and distinguished career, but for the moment, at least, you stand accused. You represent the you represent the people, the what some people regard as the bad guys, the big tech from Google. Answer those questions that both Oliver and Tom have put. That actually, you know, despite Tyler's point that you may not have monopolistic pricing practices, your companies have established such extraordinary dominance over the market. You have got extraordinary advantage over all competitors that you have you occupy such a position of dominance that you are able to do things, as Oliver says, for example, that would be illegal in what he does.
I think he was talking about Amazon when he
yeah, all right, okay. But yes, he was, okay. And we don't have anyone from Amazon here, unfortunately. But broadly speaking, the same principles apply. You know, isn't that a concern that people have, that the sheer scale of a Google or an Amazon or a Facebook means that you have an ability, an access to information, and access to manipulate that data that nobody else has in ways that are not healthy for a diverse, pluralistic society?
So that's you've said a lot of complex things there. It's clear that we have access to information that others don't have, and that could be a curse and a blessing. It can be a blessing if you use that information wisely, disseminate it fairly, and use it for the advantage of everyone. And so we have to be careful about that. It's a privilege to have that. We could also, I think one of the things that Alphabet recognizes quite acutely is that we're not ensured that we will have that forever. There is no durable sense that if we ever lose our way too profoundly, that we will be allowed to maintain that position with some privilege. So for me, I mean, I can speak most thoughtfully about the healthcare dynamic of what we're exploring now. And here, we're not worried about regulation. We welcome regulation because health data is incredibly important, that privacy is supreme, that we're careful and thoughtful what we do with it, and we don't object to regulation. We just want those, and I think the previous panel spoke about this, I think we would actually appreciate and benefit from thoughtful, informed, educated regulation, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I also know how it works. I see the ebb and flow of popularity and of the glow that tech had 2 years ago, which may be coming off now and will someday ascend again, that for the most part, technology will bring benefit to the world. For the most part, it still has to be applied thoughtfully, because like any advance, it can be for good or for bad. And so we, I think, welcome careful thought about how we do this. And the one thing about us is we don't drag with us a very lengthy legacy. These companies are 20 years old. We're 20 years old now. I hope that we exhibit the tendency that we're willing to change, that we're willing to modify, that we're willing to improve in an effort to make sure that we serve our customers first. In my case, that we're deeply loyal and concerned about the well-being of the people who trust us, and that we do everything on a pretty level and fair playing field. And we're willing to listen and try to do a better job of that.
Thanks. Before we've had the first round there of arguments, but before we proceed, I would like to come to the poll poll question from the audience. I think for the audience that we have, if you could turn to your apps, there should be a poll there.
Apps that a technology company created, probably.
Exactly, and that may or may not influence your decision how to vote on this poll. I'm actually trying to find it myself. I don't see it right now. Do we have the poll?
You know, the rule for sessions like this is you never go
Never rely on technology.
Never go on with children, animals, or live technology. Right?
I don't see the poll. So sorry about that. We'll maybe you see it, or maybe we have it.
There you go. Our new regulations.
Oh, there we go. There it is. You do have it. Yeah. So our new regulations required for the way user data is managed on the platforms we use every day, and we'll come back. So far seems to be a pretty solid majority for yes, as far as I can see. We'll come back and see whether the discussion changes. We're up at about 89% for yes. So we agree what these new regulations are required. That brings me conveniently to Tom. What should they be? What do we need to do?
Well, you know, traditionally, the way we have dealt with this is to take 21st century technology, discuss it in 20th century terms, and propose 19th century regulation. And that's not the solution. One of the things that we can learn from Google and others, and that Google and others have a responsibility, I think, to teach all of us in the public and in the government, is, okay, in this new distributed environment, how does that operate differently from the old centralized industrial economy, and what does that mean to oversight? Because if you stop and think about it, the rules that were put in place for the industrial economy were based on the same kind of rules-based scope and scale organization that was the Industrial Revolution. So when you have industry that the guy on the shop floor has rules, his supervisor has rules, his manager has rules, and a bureaucracy is created to oversee those rules, why are we surprised that government comes in and says, we have bureaucratic rules to oversee the bureaucratic rules? That structure won't work in the information age. How do we bring a distributed, agile, evolving approach to the way we look at the issues raised by the new technology? And the companies themselves can help in that education. But it's going to require a sea change in the thought process of just how government works so that we have a 21st century government rather than a 19th century government.
Let me, if I may turn to you again, Tyler. One way in which one way in which people call for more regulation is for more transparency. One of the questions that people have about the way in which companies like Google, but some of the Chinese companies too, dominate their markets is through algorithms that are, that many people have doubts about. People think that, rightly or wrongly, that Google will favor certain sets of search results if you go and search for something which will favor it commercially. That's because of the algorithm. Google will deny that, and I'll absolutely give Andy an opportunity to do so. But maybe one way in which we could just resolve this dispute is to make is to have some transparency around the algorithm. We have transparency around all kinds of other things that consumers have. If you go into a supermarket, it tells you on the back of the product exactly what's in that product, exactly how much, what chemicals and what natural things are in the product and what it'll do to you. Could we have that kind of transparency about the products that Google and Facebook and Alibaba and Tencent and others provide to their consumers?
It's very hard to make an algorithm transparent. It changes all the time. Intuitively, the best way to understand it is to just use, say, Google search and see what comes up. But more important is a general point about regulation. If you're worried about monopoly and you want to impose privacy regulation, transparency regulation, whatever, you are cementing in the power of incumbents. Do Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix have the legal teams, the communications staff, the money to deal with the regulation, to deal with Washington and the European Union? Absolutely, they will be okay. It's the younger firms, it's the startups, it's the new innovators, the new technologies that will come along that may in some way solve some of these privacy problems or transparency problems. That's what you are penalizing. So you are risking taking the features of the status quo that you do not like, and every status quo is imperfect, and making them much more permanent. So one needs to be very careful. And if you look in particular at my government, the US government, A, it's headed by Donald Trump. And even if you like Trump on some issues, I don't like the notion of Trump regulating what is in essence speech. B, we tried to run Obamacare as a tech product run by the government. It absolutely failed. The website literally did not work. And personnel records of the US government have been hacked in a major way. Outside of our military, our tech prowess, or what Congress people understand, it is remarkably backward. It is not like Singapore. And to think that you will trust this mechanism to regulate, say, transparency or privacy, I personally simply do not.
But Oliver, the European Union, the European Commission in particular, has been very aggressive in regulation and enforcement on some of these issues, and is continuing to investigate Google in particular. So they've been able to have a very aggressive approach, including fines and penalties against Google. Why and the US seems to have taken a much lighter touch approach. What explains what the European Commission's approach?
Yeah, we have different ethical understandings and different ideas on how markets should work. That's culturally different. So I don't say they're better or worse, they're just different. And we are pretty happy that we have this sort of called GDPR that protects private data, and have for the first time across 27 countries similar standards. Now, there's still evasion around that, but it's a good start to have that. By the way, personally, I'm not a fan of fines because they don't solve anything. At the end of the day is you need to have a forward-looking view on how markets should work. I would like to add one point, as we heard from the industrial world where we're going into the future. Consumers, and we just did an amazing study inside, have different expectations about products when they buy online. I'll give you an example. We were doing an insurance product for a large mobile phone producer who has an amazing brand. And the mobile phone distribution agency takes about 80% of the premium as commissions for itself, and is a market standard we thought about nothing. Now we have in Allianz now a principle is called minimum value to consumers. So for every product we have certain indications, i.e. a large share of the premium is commission, where we do not feel comfortable, and we test these products. So in this case, we said, you know, how is it that this company makes a 70% margin on its phone, and the consumers overwhelmingly said that's totally okay. When we told them that 80% of their premium was going into commission, they were outraged. They said that's a fraud, and this company should have a big problem. So in the same tech platform, in the same kind of environment, you have totally different perceptions of societies about what is ethical and unethical depending on what the product is. And I can give you another example on healthcare. If you give the wrong information on healthcare to consumers, you're really in deep trouble. In China, that happened with Baidu. They sold certain products or recommended certain products that were actually leading to death cases, and that really has damaged them. So I think we need to really go a little deeper than discuss this at the surface and saying, you know, what is society expecting? And as you saw earlier, 90% of the people say we need rules. So we need to have rules, but the question is, how do we get to them? That's the difficult part. The answer is not to not have rules.
Well, the question is, who makes the rules? Okay, and right now we're existing in an environment where the innovative companies that have been able to become the dominant players in the market are using that position to make the rules. We saw it before in the industrial age. You know, we saw Carnegie and Rockefeller and all these people making the rules until society came in and said, wait a minute, time out. We need to have a set of rules that worry about competition, that worry about consumer and worker protection and rights and how we are going to have those going forward. The first session today had a fascinating discussion about the potential demise, or at least the diminishment of liberal democratic capitalism because of the rise of both on the right and on the left extreme ideas that threaten the concepts of capitalism. And the base of that rationale was because of the insecurities that people were feeling as a result of technology and other changes. We have to address how do we create stability and security, and that is through collective rules, not rules made by those who end up benefiting from the rules.
Andy, you seem to indicate your assent to the majority opinion in the room that there was more regulation needed.
I think good regulation breeds good companies. I'm not a fan of bad regulation. I want the record to reflect strongly. Capricious, silly, politically driven regulation will do nothing. The two forces that I think that we have a responsibility to do a very good job on is I do think we can increase some dynamics of transparency. I think it's so silly to think we could publish the algorithm in the newspaper, your newspaper even, and let anyone read it.
You could give it to us exclusively.
Right.
If
it wouldn't make any difference. And these algorithms evolve, and there's many variables that go into them, and they're temporally driven, and they're driven by, as anyone who understands how machine learning works in these neural nets and the way the algorithms are derived, they're constantly evolving. There's new events that change the order of importance of things by the minute, or if not by the second. So transparency isn't as easy as folks think, but we could be better at it. We could be less, make sure we stay out of the notion that we're some walled fortress. We could honor the consumer and honor the patient and make sure that we're very, very careful to do what's always best for them. And you can make a lot of money doing what's best for the people. It's fine to do that.
You could publish more videos of your staff meetings held after important presidential elections, for example. That would that would provide a degree of transparency.
I mean, if people think because the executives at a company have a particular political bent, it doesn't change the way that algorithm works, by the way. And if you notice that many conservative forces in the US are extremely adept at using media. And in fact, our counter company, Facebook, is accused of being used to influence the opposite outcome. So I don't know if any of that matters. That seems like political theater, much less something that's going to be durable or important. And I do think that thoughtful regulation, like some of the places in healthcare or in the financial industry, we could do a better job of financial regulation as well. I think there's places where it has a role, and maybe it does give the big folks an advantage because we're able to accept it, we're able to understand it, we're able to implement it better than entrepreneurs. So I also want to be careful about over-regulation, because what made Silicon Valley great was there's a lot of people who had ideas in their garages and who turned them into some of the largest companies in the world.
I mean, just on your point, if I may say so, and I don't want to get into too much of a back and forth on this, but it does seem a slightly odd proposition to say that for a company that deals in so much it deals so much of its business is about information, the publication of information, the retrieval of information, that the views, the outlook, the political leanings of the people who run that company would have absolutely zero effect on the way in which that information is published. It seems, I mean, it beggars belief, to be honest with you.
I mean, I think Alphabet has values. We have values about equality. We have values about things that permeate the way that we hire people. I think we have universally accepted things that we would find offensive. We don't let things on YouTube. We have policies. And those policies reflect a set of values that, frankly, we're proud of those values. And we'd hope to sustain them no matter what pressures put on us. But that's different than regulation.
Yeah, let me come to Andy's defense, as unaccustomed as I am, Andy. But let me come to Andy's defense here for a second, because the First Amendment and the right of association, nobody has changed that. He has those rights the same as everybody else. There is, however, in the argument that he has made and the argument that Tyler has made, and their defense of the poor, small entrepreneur, the guy, two guys and a dog in a garage with a great idea, being damaged by regulation. Fact of the matter is that the amount of entrepreneurial activity has declined in this space because they can't get access to the essential assets, which is the information that is locked in this bottleneck by a handful of companies. And therefore, speaking as a former venture capitalist, what VCs end up doing is engaging in a race, which is how fast can I steal a march on the dominant carrier, the dominant player, before they wake up, at which time they're going to have to either buy me or shut me down because they've got the information. And that is the way that entrepreneurism is played today. And that's a different kind of a model. And so what we do need to have is to say that whatever regulation there is, it needs to recognize the dominance that exists in the market, and you need to treat dominant companies differently than you do two guys and a dog in a garage.
Let me just, and picking up from that, Tyler, if I may come to you, how secure are these apparent monopolies, Google and Alibaba and Facebook and Amazon, maybe you could argue, you could certainly argue. You know, this is a very disruptive time, right? Technology, innovation is going on at a remarkable pace. That's become a cliche of modern life. They do seem to have very, very strong, entrenched market positions at the moment. But what are the barriers to entry? How imaginable is it that we could be seeing Google superseded by something else in 3, 5, 10 years' time?
I think Uber is a great case study of many of these points. When Uber simply started, it was not regulated. If they had had to ask permission from all of those cities, they would not have gotten it. So ask yourself a basic question. Are you glad Uber just went ahead and did it? It was a bumpy ride in some ways. The company developed some propensities that were not entirely healthy, but still, nonetheless, I'm very glad Uber just did it. Uber then tried to expand to other markets. In many of them, most of them abroad, it has lost or retreated, Singapore being one of many examples. This is not a sector with insurmountable advantages. It was once Nokia that would never be caught up to. It was MySpace that had an insurmountable advantage. Of course, Facebook surpassed it. There will be 5G, there may be virtual reality, other forms of internet technology that will change who are the winners and the losers, who will win the race to develop even much more effective artificial technology. That's going to remix this entire sector. When sectors are changing, you tend to want a minimum of regulation because the dynamic gains from innovations such as Uber outweigh the static costs of some of the bumps along the way.
But nobody's talking about entry permission. Right?
It's only because no one thought to regulate ride sharing that Uber was able to do what it did.
I respectfully disagree, Tyler. I mean, the issue here is not, you are trying to define regulation as permission to enter. I believe in the permissionless innovation that has happened as a result of the digital revolution. The result is, but the effect is, it has also resulted in permissionless invasion of privacy, okay? Permissionless interruption of competitive markets, permissionless intrusion into democratic processes. Now the question is, how are you going to deal with the issues that are created? Not, can I have this new idea and bring it forth? Of course. But what are the core issues of dominant companies that affect economies and individuals, and how do you deal with those?
I'll give Tyler a chance to respond, but we don't have a lot of time. We have a number of questions from the audience. Let me pitch the first one to Andy, if I may. Should patients, consumers, and other stakeholders be given a say in how data platforms are run?
Absolutely. I think ultimately they own that data and they have a right to have a say. And if it doesn't benefit them, they shouldn't contribute to it. Without benefit to the individual, none of these companies would ultimately succeed. So we have to keep that in mind at every step we make. Does it confer some benefit to the people who help us? And if it doesn't, then, so they have the absolute say in it. And I think we're strong advocates of that. They should have a say in the way it's used. They should be informed of how it is used, clearly informed. Not mystically checked, I accept at the end of 72 pages that scroll by on your phone. I think we should do a very good job of making sure people understand how and what we will do with that data, how we will use it, and how it benefits them.
Oliver, if I may, a question from the audience. I'm going to ask you this one. With increased scrutiny on how big tech monetizes personal data, is there an emerging model where people will be paid for the use of their data? Is this more likely to be implemented by the public or the private sector?
I think it's a great question. I always thought that the real innovation is to go to consumers and say, I help you manage your data and I help you to auction it to the companies that want to use it. That is what, if I didn't have this job, I would try to do. I would call it Allianz Trésor and basically go to our 250 million clients and say, I'll make sure that you know what they know about you and to auction it. But to be very clear, yes, we have to have a few of these things happening in the future. We have to have it, and it's going to come. So I agree with Tyler in terms of the innovation. Again, we're debating. I would like to point on to one thing on competition that you didn't mention, is the fact that we can, as classical company, actually can have access to startups, and the reality is you can't. And you can look at China, which is super innovative, but you also see that behind almost all of the unicorns, there's always 3 names that show up. Always the same 3 names, because as a private company, you cannot afford to invest at these valuations, number one, and you don't have access. And the second thing is, there is a second point behind all of our debates, is maybe that we have also a form of war and competition between, the US, China, and the West going on, is who is going to have the largest tech companies, and are we not competing between countries now in a different sphere than war? We're actually, who is going to conquer the internet? And we're allowing large companies to be so dominant because we want rather a US company to be dominant than a Chinese company, and we're not even debating that.
So maybe big tech is going to replace diplomacy, and the famous phrase that, war by another name. But, and that brings me to another question, and I'll ask this of you, Tom, and others feel free to chime in too. And this is on this exact question of kind of global competition. If you strongly regulate the fearsome 5, as Sir Martin Sorrell calls them, the big 5 US tech companies, don't you hand the Chinese tech giants a significant competitive advantage?
So we cannot look at how do marketplaces function out of fear as to what a reaction may be. We all need to talk about there needs to be a new approach to government. It needs to be agile, it needs to be distributed, it needs to be not the way government has been done. And how do we get accord about that across the world? But we got to begin by getting accord about that inside our own economies.
Tyler, it does seem that China does have all kinds of advantages from, we talk about a regulatory environment, the relationship between the big tech companies in China and the Chinese government, the advantages over perhaps less consideration given to privacy, the advantages that seem to be accruing to China there as AI and machine learning becomes adopted. How do you expect this to play out, this sort of global competition in technology over the next few years?
I think we're going to see 2 major tech networks evolve, largely separate, the American side and then the Chinese side. And through law or regulation, neither country will let in the giants of the other. And then over time, there will be a battle as to which networks will be adopted by which other countries. the domestic advantages of the Chinese companies may be exactly what hurts them abroad. Because if you know those companies are in bed with the state, and you're, a Latin American country, you're in the Middle East, you may not want to join that network. And in the long run, I suspect many more countries will end up within the network of what the major American companies are doing.
Great point.
And actually, another question, and if anybody's got any questions they want to raise their hand, please do. We've got a few more minutes, but I have another question from the audience, and actually it's another question for you, Tyler, if I may, quickly. You've written extensively about globalization and culture. Do you think big tech can help the world become more diverse, or will we end up becoming culturally singular? And the question asks singularly focused on consumption.
It's remarkable how many artisans and indigenous people and music creators and people trying to preserve languages use the internet to record what they're doing, to sell what they're doing. So on net, it preserves diversity, but it both increases homogenization and heterogeneity at the same time. So you get big waves of change hitting your society. But if you think now, what is your ability to be some kind of small company or entrepreneur and take something for your culture and preserve, record, or sell it? That is much, much greater because of the internet, and that's the net effect.
That's great. Can I say one thing about
Yeah, please.
I'm trying to think, because, I spend some time in Singapore, and I spend a lot of time with the investors here, and I actually think there's a possible other world where it's not these two big ecosystems, the Chinese and the US. I think there are reasons to bridge them, and I think maybe I'm an optimist, but I'm actually encouraged. Each time I go to China, I find companies that I find innovative and interesting, and I find ones that we seek partnerships with. And maybe what happens is technology, and this it may sound overly optimistic or grandiose, but maybe the interactions amongst technology actually makes the divisions of whether it's Western capitalism or state capitalism or any of those government and political forces, maybe good technology extends past borders or cultures or other things and makes it more likely that there will be only one system.
If there are any, yes, there are some questions over here from the audience over here. Yeah, gentleman here, if you could identify yourself, please.
Yes, my name is Klaus Hamid. I'm running a venture fund in Europe called Lakestar. And we are discussing regulation, and regulation only works if you can also sanction it. And I've heard 2 times that the EU is going very aggressively against the big ones. I'm not sure I understand that, or the magnitude of calibration. I mean, Facebook asked for permission to buy WhatsApp, and they said they can't merge the data in the back end, and that's why they got the permission. And when they suddenly, with so many thousands of PhDs, could merge the data on the back end, to everybody's surprise, then they were fined with $130 million. Apple was fined with $2 billion, which was 31 days of profit and 0.3% of market cap. But when you then see that Deutsche Bank was fined with 7 billion when they had 35 billion market cap, or Volkswagen was fined with 22 billion when they had 55 billion market cap, then I think these kind of sanctioning has a total different impact than these rather ridicule numbers that the EU put in place.
It's a fair point. Who wants to take that? It doesn't seem that as tough as the European Commission is generally deemed to be, it's not exactly dented your market cap, has it? Or damaged? Doesn't seem to have. Has it significantly changed? Changed the way in which the company behaves?
Yeah, I mean, I think we think about it. We don't like the fines. They're not help. I mean, this absolute amount of money, whether you think it's material or not, is not the debate that we have. It's not, oh yeah, we got away with a little fine. I think that we are concerned every time that a regulator reaches that level of animosity towards what we're doing. We take it seriously, and it's not just the money is not the only thing that matters. It may again sound naive or grandiose, but it's not good. We don't want to piss people off. It's not in our business plan. It wasn't the first thing we said was make people angry. And I think it is good business to consider what the thought behind that regulation is, whether the penalty is trivial or truly painful. We're all, most of us grew up as great students, and we don't like getting scolded by any teacher. We want to do what's right. And so it did have a big effect on us, and it does have a big effect on us, and we hope never to get another one.
We may have time for one more quick question. I did see another hand go up, or we can... No, in that case, I do want to wrap up, but before we do, I want to come back to our poll. There was a pretty solid majority in the room, almost sort of North Korean election kind of level of support for more regulation. We'll see if that's changed. Well, it has a little bit, actually. So I'm not sure who gets the most credit for that on the panel, but you seem to have shifted some opinion. Now we're going back a little bit. Oh, no, maybe not. Well, there's been a very slight dent in the large majority for more regulation for big tech, at least from people in this room. I want to say thank you very much indeed to the audience. Thanks again to the Singapore Summit for having us. This has been a fascinating discussion on one of the most important topics of our age. And I particularly want to thank our really very distinguished panel for their time, for their intelligence, for their patience, and for their observations. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking them.